Hello and welcome to the Clean New Deal. This is a little bit of a reversal for you here. I'm going to be interviewing Patrick instead of the other way around on this channel. Patrick, I mean, the main reason for this is that we're trying to get to the details of everything that you're trying to talk about here with your project, the Clean New Deal. So I've read through it several times. I've gone through like all the pieces, and a lot of the stuff is stuff that's, familiar from a lot of the work that we've done over the past several years. In fact, I might characterize it as an aggregation of an awful lot of what we've discussed. And why don't we hear it straight from you? Give us the top lines here of what is the Clean New Deal.
Well, I appreciate that, Eric. And to set the tone for those of you who don't know, but many of you may, but hopefully we're growing this audience in a significant way because the country's just taken a U turn and not a moment too soon, considering this is really collectively what Eric and I have been in the midst of for the past, let's call it 14 years. We originally went on this incredible journey where we started with the work that we made a film called Forward 13 Waking Up the American Dream, where we had the opportunity to basically serve the Occupy Wall Street movement after the 2008 great financial crisis to try to find out what the hell was going on. Because really, all we knew at the time was the disaster that I had personally experienced, and kind of Eric to a degree on a periphery, but he was a little bit fortunate that he sideslipped out of the avalanche and I got swept up in it. Eric was the first person I made the phone call to. And the next thing I know, we were able to put together a situation where we got on the road and we became documentarians. We've been producers for quite a while beforehand, and we had worked together on a television show together, ironically, in the housing industry that ultimately became sort of the bed of all of the things that we ended up having to ask questions and discover that took us years and years and years. But on that journey, what happened was we ended up, I think, going to approximately 23 to 25 Occupy Wall Street encampments around the country.
It was about
And
that, yeah.
and our timing was such that we started really in Salt Lake City, Utah, but then we made our way up to the Northwest, around the West Coast, Southwest, through the Heartland, all the way up through the Rust Belt. And we landed the DC, New York City corridor, literally the time period that Occupy Wall Street was being shut down by then what appeared to be the government, or in certain cases, whatever the city police were, and so on and so forth, in a coordinated way.
If you
But
don't mind me putting just a touch of detail on that,
sure.
Patrick, one of the main reasons why we kind of like, rode this wave the way that we did was that we went up to Portland initially because as we were trying to get down to the bottom of exactly what happened to Patrick and his family as far as like their foreclosure experience was concerned, the first place that we went to go see was in Portland, Oregon, which was the servicer that was the outfit that basically Patrick and his family were in touch with, that were leading him down this road that eventually culminated in their foreclosure. And so that was the origin of the journey. And then if the Occupy movement was the water, then the crackdown was the wave that we rode, because it seemed like the crackdown was going from West Coast to East Coast as we were going. And so such horrifically serendipitous, is that even a word? The serendipity of it was palpable, I guess would be one way of putting it, in that the entire reason for the trip, and for the documentary was to get to the bottom of Patrick's financial duress through the foreclosure of his home. And what we found was that he was one of millions of people that we discovered through our just happening by, the Occupy movement all the way across the country. And so I just wanted to add that tiny little bit of extra detail as far as like, how this whole thing came together, because it started off as like us trying to tell this tiny little story of what happened to this tiny little family. And that expanded to the entirety of not only the country, but quite honestly, the rest of the financialized world.
Right, and it never ended, and
Right.
that's the situation, but I gotta just react to what you said because it was so extraordinary when we look back at this. Because I just happened to rewatch Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, the film we did together, our first full feature-length documentary together that you just released, our team, however we wanna describe it, just released for free on YouTube, and as I was rewatching that, based on what you just said, my ex-wife, unfortunately, really gave an extraordinary sort of an account of what it was that we went through that you just described. And we didn't know it at the time. In fact, I was very nervous putting that information in the film to begin with, what Marty had revealed. But as it turns out, and I wouldn't find out for literally years later, that what we went through and what she was describing was what happened to millions
Right.
of
It,
people. Exactly as she
oh,
described it. Now, here's the thing that everybody that's watching this needs to understand. Not only did it happen to millions of people, but millions of people to this day don't understand what took place. And that's the whole point of why we're going through this process. But I want to just pick up on what Eric just mentioned in terms of why we went to the servicer first. We had no idea what the servicer was doing. What the servicer was doing, because it was really what spawned me to want to make this thing happen, was I knew I was getting played. I knew something didn't add up, and I knew there was something terribly wrong. And when we went to do a sort of like an old 60 Minutes, not to be confused with the new 60 Minutes, i.e., Nora O'Donnell and the interview she did last week with Trump, which was a joke off the heels of all of this consolidation of media and what that means, which really further underscores why we're doing what we're doing. But I'll never forget, because this made it into the film, because we had this GoPro camera in the car. One of the few times that Eric appears in Forward 13 in his voice, as he says, as we're approaching the servicer, it appears that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. And as it turns out, that was by design in a massive, massive way that to this day, no one fully understands. Now, what's extremely important about that moment is that when we got on the road, it was kind of a twofold situation. One, it was to try to find out what happened to me, but that was just what I was thinking as an entry point to see what was happening to the rest of the country. And as it turns out, that's exactly what we ended up discovering in more ways than one, more ways than we could ever possibly recount, quite frankly. But as we're moving through, let's call it at that time the zeitgeist, and honestly, what I just happened to rewatch a couple of days ago, and it brought tears to my eyes because I saw my son at the age of like, I don't know, he's got to be like 5 or 6 years old. He's now approaching 21, and just the memories of it all. But yet, you could actually hold it up to this moment in our country's history, and it's step and repeat, literally exact same moment. Go ahead.
just like every issue that we had back then, we have right now, but we're kind of on the other side of it. Where if 2008 was like the warning shot, you know, we're now well past that. We're seeing like the actual war, at this point. And so what really is troubling about that, and I think the entire reason for why we're talking today, is that clearly, despite the fact that we had every opportunity to have every lesson learned from the 2008 financial crisis, it is clear that none of the people in power either learned those lessons or had the will to do anything about it. And there's various reasons for that. And I think that that is exactly what the Clean New Deal is addressing.
Right. We wouldn't know that, like you said, unless we went through this grand odyssey to be on the other side of it. And of course, what's in between that, what we didn't expect was we did a multi-part project called The Con that really is the blueprint for how all of this stuff works. And believe it or not, that work was only half of what we actually have. And so what took place is Forward 13 Waking Up the American Dream was prologue. The Con was the actual story, chapter and verse, literally, of what we came to discover was the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history. But here's the caveat that never ended. Now, on Tuesday, we saw a nationwide sort of redress of grievances, as it were, maybe a rebuttal to all things MAGA and Trump. A lot of people are trying to call it a blue wave. Most notably, we saw Zoran Mondani, the young New York mayor now. And obviously, that was exciting to watch from a standpoint that everything that we have revealed in our work collectively was to realize that because of where we started, based on what Eric just prefaced, that this was all a con. This was all a ginormous global financial setup that targeted people almost in the exact same way. I need people to understand this. I used to use this as metaphors, okay? I used to say, you know how the fraternity with a bunch of guys that roofie a bunch of girls that gang rape them, and then they all lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate and act as if, the girl was asking for it sort of situation, in how disgusting and despicable that sort of behavior is. Blame the victim, so to speak, right? That what we discovered was that that wasn't a metaphor. That was reality. Now, over the course of the last several months, so many things have come into clearer view. Again, Eric and I are on the other side of this now. You might think of it as the Grand Canyon in between. We had to go down and get through the river and climb up the mountain and everything else to be able to achieve this clarity of how these things work. But for example, a lot of people are really justifiably so fixated on the Epstein story. Now, the Epstein story has a lot of components. A big part of the story that most people are fixated on is the salacious nature of very rich and powerful men preying on young women in depraved sort of scenarios, but obviously all of which is illegal, that was never held to account. That these Johns, so to speak, were above the law. And I think a lot of people, millions of people, are like, their narrative is these women suffered horrific scenarios that were never held to account. Now, there was a lot of, obviously money that switched hands because of settlements and so forth, but that's, there was also a lot of really horrible stuff that happened that's never really fully been resolved. But recently, and I've been in the thick of it because I did a great interview with this guy from the New York Times, a gentleman by the name of David Enrich, who, after all these years, is now revealing on the front page of the New York Times the relationship between J.P. Morgan Chase that was financing really all of these goings on, which opens up a whole nother can of worms, right? And this can of worms was, how was somebody like Epstein able to create this honeypot scenario that put all of these powerful people in the same place to be above the law? And then you discover we're talking billions of dollars changing hands that nobody ever really drew a red flag to, because we know, Eric and I know from our work, that the system has stopgap measures, particularly in the financial system, called, in this case, suspicious activity reports, that are supposed to report anything that's suspicious. It could be drug running, money laundering, terrorism, the sort of thing that Epstein was involved with entrapment, yada, yada, yada. And as it turns out, and this just recently was revealed, that JP Morgan Chase provided over $1 billion of financial support, and then that would lead into Deutsche Bank and Bear Stearns and many other scenarios. But we're just discovering about this now. It's 2025. The Jeffrey Epstein thing basically came to a head in 2007, 8-ish, right around the same time we started our journey. But the parallel that people need to understand is that what Eric and I discovered, that's leading to why we're talking about the Clean New Deal, is that what millions of people got entangled in was predatory lending that used the honey trap of something that a lot of families desire and need above all else: shelter, to raise families. That's why I got into a house. I had recently been married. We recently had a son. It was time to settle down. I had income at the time, got into my first home. But as it turns out, I was involved in a predatory loan mechanism that I had no idea at the time that I was involved with. Very similar to, let's say, for example, and I'll mix metaphors, but it's the same story, right? So we saw that P. Diddy recently went through his trial, and what frequently came out of that sort of revelations was the freak off. And the freak off was, say, people who were chasing stardom and they happened to be singers, they wanted access to power, they wanted to be seen, they wanted to use this, because we know in the business, when you're around powerful people in the system and you get discovered and you're playing their game, you have a better chance of being seen and having an opportunity to work through the system. But what you weren't aware of, and I've seen this stuff since I was in Hollywood back in the early 2000s, actually in the 90s, dating myself, I'm an old man now. But ultimately, what P. Diddy was doing was getting people in a situation where ultimately they'd use drugs, they'd use the attractiveness of the power, all of these things. And these people would literally be stuck in a scenario where they would be gang raped. They would be gang raped in a way that it was like, in the end, it was, I think I saw a lot of people doing the same thing that they did with Epstein, and also the same thing with the 2008 crisis: blame the victim. They had it coming to them. They got in over their head. This is what they were doing. They know what game they were playing. If you think that, I ask you to consider, well, do you have the same sort of outlook on the girls in the Epstein, vertical, or how about those in the P. Diddy? And I use these metaphors because they're real life scenarios that we've all just lived through. In fact, gone through them in 2025. But
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, I'd say that it's more than that. It's a pattern, right? I mean,
Sure.
we go back to the SNL crisis, and, what these similar tactics were being used for was in order to keep people in line, right? I mean, you get people involved with the deal because there's like all this money floating around and you're like, dropping all this honey in their ear, right? And they agree to do it, but in order to keep them in line, in order to make sure they don't back out of those deals, in order to make sure that they don't whistleblow, in order to make sure that they don't do anything that's going to rock the boat, they put them in these compromising scenarios, make sure that there's like video or audio or some other form of documentation for it. And then if you feel inclined to back out or to say something, all they have to do is hold up the fact that they have this tape of you saying something, you doing something, whatever the case might be. And that was exactly how it was used with Charles Keating, back during the SNL era. And so what becomes very apparent with the situations that you're talking about, concerning Diddy and Epstein and stuff like that, is that it's basically just another version of that same thing, right? They get these rich and powerful people who have something that they want, i.e., money, right? In order to get into this particular deal, this particular investment, this particular whatever it is. And they make that happen, but then they get them on tape, get them involved with things that they'll be able to hold over them. So they're now compromised, and that keeps them in line. And so it's more than just a metaphor, Patrick. I'd say that, nah, this is an established pattern of exactly how things work.
Well, amen. And that's exactly what we proved on a mission that you used to ridicule me and say I was Captain Ahab chasing the white whale. But as it turned out, what we did was we discovered the entirety of the system that everybody now is in search for. So, for example, to take that a step further, but to use the parallel to the housing bubble, there's a lot of variations of the predation. We know in our story, we found an African American woman by the name of Addie Polk who was predated upon in a specific way. It was called straw buying. They could set people up by basically using their identities, using identity theft to steal loans out and then have the powers that be foreclose on the loans of elderly people who own their houses that they didn't see it coming. And that's what set us off on this journey that would ultimately lead to our discovery of the only RICO conviction of this crime in the entire country and the world for that matter, that was premised on a $4.5 trillion housing bubble that ultimately went to a $900 trillion global calamity. Now, that being said, the situation that is more parallel to that than anything else is the nature of the setup, right? Honey trap that I'm going to get you involved with a situation that you can't get out because you can't see all the angles, first and foremost. Now, when you don't understand the financial system, when you don't understand the legal system, when you don't understand the geopolitical system, when you don't have a law degree, when you don't have 30 years of experience in predation, you have no idea this is even possible. This is a world that is far, far beyond most people's imagination, particularly the coordination of it all. Now, we hear frequently a lot of people say things like conspiracy theory, this and that. My friends, conspiracy is just people getting together for an outcome. And if it's a crime, we have laws that remedy that called racketeering, influence, corrupt organization laws that should be used in these specific cases, which of course we discover to be true. But moving forward in this analysis to understand what everybody is saying on the other side of Tuesday, with Mandani all the way through, Prop 50 in California to obviously this blue wave, there's starting to be this sort of movement of anti-corruption in a meaningful way, right? We're hearing it everywhere. In fact, Mondani just happened to mention yesterday and was trending on Blue Sky, and I found it to be very smart and hopeful at the same time, but not even anywhere near what the information is that Eric and I have. That, again, to remind you why we're talking about this, is going to lead us to understand what the Clean New Deal is. But Zoran Mondani has named, among other women leaders on his transition team, is a woman by the name of Lena Khan, who came out of the Federal Trade Commission. And a lot of people are very excited about that because, as I was a little bit critical of, as this Mondani mayoral sort of candidacy slash campaign that became this sort of lightning rod for a blue wave, quite frankly. And there's a lot of things we could discuss about, where he fits on the spectrum, if you will, in terms of what the Democratic Party is at the moment. But the most important facet is that when he's thinking about Lena Khan in this environment in Manhattan, which is the belly of the beast, which has probably the most corrosive, corrupt financial apparatus on the face of the planet, just because of its scale Okay. I would say Moscow is probably more corrupt, maybe, quite frankly, London to a certain degree. But the volume, the scope, the international scenario of all things, which is our financial system, is really the overlords, if you will, of the situation, of which they're trying to poke a hole in, right? But with just certain platforms, like if you were to think about his campaign and what he actually talked about, was okay, he's a social democrat. He's going to have policies that are going to lead to the affordability crisis, which is now in certain sectors becoming the sort of blue wave initiative, because that's the same thing happening around the country, all of which emanate from the story that Eric and I have revealed over the course of the last 14 years. Further to that point, the people that we've been involved with for a very long time, particularly because of what Eric said, going back to the savings and loan crisis, to put this into perspective. So, William K. Black was the general counsel of the Office of Thrift Supervision out of San Francisco with an elite team of guys led by Ed Gray during the savings and loan crisis that really did the impossible. They were able to get, and we could go into a little bit more detail about this, but they were able to get a sort of synergy of a pattern that would lead to Bill's sort of ultimate economic theory that proved out in this legal causation called control fraud. And as a result, they put together 33,000 criminal referrals that would ultimately lead to 7,000 criminal convictions of white collar elite executives, something that had never happened in history, not before or since. As it turns out, that was the exact same story that we had to uncover in the con. And the reason we had to uncover that in the con is because the government chose not to. The government at this time, when we started our journey under Barack Obama. Now, that's interesting because I'll just say right now, the Democratic Party is having a bit of a fissure between, okay, and I happen to be watching, let's say, Rachel Maddow and Jen Psaki and what I would consider kind of the DNC sort of apparatus within MSNBC and the communications
Mhm.
department. And you can see a tug of war happening where suddenly Barack Obama is becoming this sort of central figure. And I'm like, well, boy, that was predictable, right? But here, you and I both know that we wouldn't be in this situation if it wasn't for the Obama administration's failure. And we're not going to litigate that right here because there's so much more to it in our work that you can discover. But the reason I want to set that up into the next stage of what I'm going to introduce about the Clean New Deal is that people have been in the dark this whole time. It's like I use this quote from one of my favorite movies of all time, Devil in a Blue Dress, starring Denzel Washington back in the 90s, when he played this character called Ezekiel Rollins, when he said, I got tired of them pissing on my head, telling me it was rain. They must have thought I was some kind of new fool. What we've done this entire time is put together the building blocks of everything that the country is looking for at this very moment, because we have to have a national wave, a national revolution against the pollution of corruption in the form of tyranny. It's an American thing. We've been doing it for 248 years. On the other side of No Kings, on the other side of last Tuesday, what I'm telling you and what I'm showing you and what I'm shining a light on is that we don't have to search. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to try to find things that aren't found because we've already done it. We've already got mountains of information to the tune of thousands of hours of information that led to what this platform is. And I'll give a pause here for you to respond and ask me questions moving forward. But what the Clean New Deal is all about is this is the answer to literally everything that we're in the midst of.
So basically, let's just put it this way. If the work that was done in 413 and the con is basically the prologue to what we're experiencing now, the Clean New Deal is the antidote, perhaps, that you've devised from all the different things that we've experienced in order to try to unravel this. And so I'm going to ask you just once again, if you can, in just the most concise way possible, what is the Clean New Deal?
The Clean New Deal is exactly what the New Deal did as a result of what took place after the Great Depression. And obviously, as someone who had a lot of influence on our work, a guy by the name of Ferdinand Pecor realized, and they learned how to fix the problem. That's what this is all about.
Okay. And so as part of the Clean New Deal, it's like there's like a various different things you kind of call them precepts. The way that I was kind of looking at them was that these are the hurdles that we need to overcome in order to get there. A lot of that had to do with the various forms of immunity. let's talk a little bit more specifically about some of these things that the Clean New Deal is specifically addressing.
Sure. So what happened on our journey, Eric, is that I had to basically re-engineer my thinking of the previous 40 years of my education and everything that I thought was real, right? Because as you may recall, I had always believed in the system, in professionals and people that did the job, that did the right thing. I could never in a million years put my head around control fraud to understand the nature of complicity at a high level that professionals would actually simply be conforming to. But why? Because Upton Sinclair taught us many years ago that if you can get uh, a person's ideals to depend on his paycheck, then you can obviously coerce him into anything. And that's what we're talking about effectively. So what I had to do was understand the nature of power. And over the course of years, I had to move from are we a democracy of by and for the people? And if we are a democracy, does that mean one person, one vote is equal? Does that mean that the American people can hold power to account? You have to have character and integrity, but you also have, above all else, have to have accountability. The reason we went on our journey to create Forward 13 that ultimately led to Con and everything that we've learned in between, we learned that all of that is absolute nonsense, and it has been for a very long time. The law isn't the law, and it hasn't been. But now, because of Donald Trump and this insane waterboarding of this shit sandwich from Doge to the White House, East Lawn to ICE to basically air traffic control, and the litany goes on. And I'll mention the billions of dollars that he's looting right now from crypto. We see that the law isn't the law. The law is dead. And so the question becomes, all right, well, how do you handle that? Now, a lot of folks are thinking to themselves, well, all you have to do is have a blue wave and you have to just have Democratic governors and you just have to have a Democratic socialist win the mayor of New York City and you just have to have, Prop 50 in California and all of a sudden problem solved. No, the affordability crisis is a direct consequence of not holding corruption to account. The four questions in terms of setting up the Clean New Deal are: what is qualified immunity? What is judicial immunity? What is presidential immunity? What then is the Electoral College?
Right. Right. So one of the things that was really striking to me, and I think that in our drive, really, it's like across country during a Forward 13, and I remember us having this discussion and how it was. If I recall correctly, I felt it was a fairly powerful moment for you, because I think that what we were experiencing with 2008 was that the same things that have been affecting so many other parts of our population was finally coming to hit the most economically stable aspects of our community. The chickens were, in a way, the chickens were finally coming home to roost. I mean, that these same things that so many other populations within the country and outside of the country were experiencing, whether it was colonization type activities out in foreign countries, or whether it was the way that we were treating poor populations or minority populations within this country, it's like, yeah, well, I mean, this isn't exactly new, right? And then when 2008 happened, it's when that same thing finally came to effect, not to put too fine a point on it, the upwardly mobile white suburban America. And as soon as that happened, all of a sudden it became a problem for everybody. And not to say that, not to take anything away from anybody. I mean, it's like, for anybody, it seems to be the case that we don't care until it happens to us, right? And I think that the biggest difference between previous generations and now is that it's now happened to pretty much all of us except for the absolute top of the top of the top of the most socially and politically powerful people and fiscally powerful people on the planet. And so now that it finally encompasses all of us, we're finally starting to see people having the appropriate amount of anger. Now, for a lot of people, that was expressed through MAGA, right? Unfortunately, from my perspective, because I think that that was the wrong answer. But I think that we do need to recognize that the entire reason why Trump was able to rise to power and was able to do everything that he's done with the MAGA movement was because of that disgust, was because of that anger, was because that wave of just shitty policy and exploitation built into the system was now affecting white America. And so we're feeling that anger. Now, I think that right now we're in the process of trying to jujitsu this in some sort of way in order to get everybody on the same page and saying, hey, it's not these people over here that are your problem. It's these people up here that are. And I think that if we're able to successfully do that, then I think that there's a chance that we can all actually find that unity that we've all been looking for, that elusive, united part of the United States of America to actually do something about it. And I think that what you're proposing, what this collection of ideas of the Clean New Deal is sort of like, okay, these are the things that we can all gather behind, amongst many others, and actually chart a path forward. So, with a response to all these different forms of immunity, you know, the, whether it's the qualified immunity of government, of police officers, right? Or the presidential immunity that's now been increased to a massive degree because of the Supreme Court, and how this all adds up, and then setting that to a side, and then the very fact that the very nature of the electoral college is anti-democratic. It's meant to keep the power within a smaller group of people, a smaller, more fiscally and socially upward mobile group of people, right? And so we're in a position where it's like, okay, we have to rethink everything. We have to rethink everything, not throw it all away, rethink everything and rebuild it in a better way. And so I think that as we're finally getting to what are the actual, like, what are the list of actions that are involved with the Clean New Deal, I think that that is the mindset that we're having. And I love number one because it's something that we've spoken about quite a bit. And one of my favorite people that we spoke to on any of our journeys together was Art Wilmarth, and he wrote the book on Glass-Steagall, on the need for the new Glass-Steagall. And so, if any of you haven't gotten that book, go get it. It's fantastic, and it really is like the definitive, tome on this first part of what we're talking about here. And so I'm going to go ahead and leave that to you. So let's talk about New Glass-Steagall. Why is that number one on your Clean New Deal?
I could have responded 100 different times with what you just laid out, which was really such a perfect sort of tee up to the audience that needs to understand how far we've been. And I'm going to start with Art Wilmar from the standpoint that when we went into his office, this guy is one of the premier experts in financial regulation on the planet, by far in the United States, which of course puts it heads and toes above a lot of other countries because we were legitimate for a long time. And Art Wilmoth was one of the reasons we were. And if we're ever going to get back to is we've got to pay attention to art. But I remember he had books to the ceiling. You remember that? He
Yeah,
had books in every single aspect of his office and papers. And it was like, that's how much information he had to sift through. And we had information to sift through as well. But I just want to comment on this first. So, yes, to your point about when we joined, you and I come from different backgrounds. You had a perception of me, I had a perception of you. I always thought you were Ian Astonbury of the cult when I first met you. You thought I was a loud, white guy, kind of similar to, different frat guys that you've known because you were also in a frat, I'll say. But
absolutely, I was.
so you knew the kind of guy I was, but I was always a good guy and you were always a good guy, and we ended up working very well together because of just the litany of stuff that we had done hundreds of hours before we ever got a shot to do this stuff. But I remember being a little bit shocked to your point when we got on the road during the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I remember meeting African Americans out in the streets of America and basically kind of trying to integrate my plight with why they were there. And I always got the sense that they were looking at me, and I don't want to sound, I want to be like, they were like, fool, this is what's been going on the whole time, right? To use a little bit of, jargon. And I always felt myself like, because I grew up literally I guess, ideologically in the clouds because of my upper middle class background and maybe my, as we call white privilege and all that sort of thing. And you, on the other hand, you'd always talk to me about the fact that your family was, you know, part Mexican, part Japanese, part, I believe, Cherokee. And you had this, and Irish. And you had this sort of, sum total of the world's like, having been, you basically set up and betrayed, quite frankly. And so you had that sort of mindset. And where I was coming from the very beginning of this whole thing, and this really was, I think, what was my causality to this question I'm now going to answer. Yes, I have been ambitious. I was never a socialist. I was never a communist. I have always been an entrepreneur. Now, does that mean I'm a capitalist? Yeah, but we really need to get in the nuance of what capitalism is, because what you and I discovered is that we don't have capitalism. What we have is socialism, or even more extreme, the Politburo for the criminal class. Now, how do you get to understand that? Well, you got to unpack everything that we're talking about. And so, as this, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, when you do have that kind of close-knit relationship between government and corporations, that's actually what fascism is.
Amen. And what did I always used to call it? That you always said was redundant?
Corporate fascist state.
And you always used to kind of have a little bit of a, kind of like you're ridiculing me for that. You're like, well, that's redundant.
That's redundant, right?
And then what was my response? My response was, that's on purpose to drive home the point, but that's exactly right. Right. So just a quick segue into precept number one. Look, we're not a democracy. Okay. Everybody already knows that, don't they? One person, one vote. That's ridiculous. That's because of unbelievable, exorbitant privilege of the financial class that can buy elections. That's been going on for a very long time. Trump is just the ultimate consequence of that. But ultimately, in the same vein, you have to understand that we're not a capitalist system. We have to reconfigure the name, in my opinion. I know that you frequently have disdain for capitalism, and I think you can argue very effectively why we are, but let me just get this out of my mouth. The notion of capitalism for me, and I had Paul J push back slightly on this when I said it to him. I've always said that capitalism is about risk reward. The idea is that if you have a great idea, if you can put together great answers, if you can be, Ford to build the assembly line and the Model T, and you can, do what the paradigm requires to build this kind of, incredible Herculean middle class sort of thing, wow, that's amazing, right? But I always thought that if you make mistakes and you do stupid things, or if you're involved with a massive crime, then you go down and you pay the price for it, never to be heard from again. Maybe you go to jail. Maybe the market never resurrects you. What we discovered is that's ludicrous. That's the whole point. This whole system is configured for the top, zero, zero, one. Okay. And they've been getting away with trillions of dollars illegally 14 years that Mondani doesn't know about. Quite frankly, Khan doesn't know about. And if she does, it's in the back of her mind because that wasn't her position. And they're both young. And this is stuff that preceded this. Just like, for some people, the savings and loan crisis is ancient history. My God, it was just like 30 years ago. And the bottom line is, but that's what set this whole thing in motion. And what people have to understand, to your point, a shortcut is the power has absolute control. And what do we know through history? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. When a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. What is that? Tyranny. Okay, well, that's anti-Americanism is the way I was taught. So again, this whole journey was to reconfigure my mind, which led me to precept number one, because we just talked about all of the perversions of power, right? If you've got the cops above the law, if you've got the judges above the law, if you've got the president above the law, and then you've got a minority that can, through smoke and mirrors, get their guy elected when it's against the critical will, you're not a democracy. And if the system has a global racketeering enterprise that sets up hundreds of millions of people worldwide and destroys the world based on racketeering, if that system doesn't go down and you give it tens of trillions of dollars to float itself, you don't have capitalism. So here's the funny thing, America. This isn't the first time in our history that we knew that. Right after, during the Great Depression, that led to what Eric prefaced this question 10 minutes ago on Glass-Steagall, was the fact that we had an investigation by a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand Pecora, who Eric and I discovered because of all the wonderful people we interviewed in our work, that led us to understand stuff we didn't study in college. That there was an investigation into what created the Great Depression. And as a result of that, and many of the same things that took place in the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, and quite frankly, everything that's happening now, everything, and we can talk about that later, is the exact same thing, only more sophisticated because technology can move figures much faster, but it's the same sort of smoke and mirrors, okay? Glass-Steagall figured out after the Great Depression that you've got to have aligned interests. You've got to have a separation of commercial banking and investment banking. Why? Because supposedly in a capitalistic system, you need to have people that take risks so that they can do big things to create companies like Apple. That's the idea, right? But at the same time, if you conflate that with commercial banking, what you can ultimately do is you can gamble with other people's money. It becomes a smoke and mirrors. It becomes a parlor trick. It becomes a casino. And everybody talks about the casino, like our financial system is a casino. But every time I walk into a casino, I want to know what game I'm playing. I want to know how that game is played because I'm not going to sit down and I'm going to risk my money in the event that I don't know what I'm doing unless I'm super drunk. And if I go face down, then I got to lose my money and pay the price. But here's the analogy. If I go face down and I lose all my money because I make stupid decisions, I'm not going to go to the gate and the casino is going to pay me 10x of the money that I lost being stupid, right? They're not going to do that. But in this financial system that we have, that's exactly what we do. We've paid tens of trillions of dollars illegally because we separated commercial banking from, excuse me, we got rid of the regulations through the 3Ds, which we call deregulation, desupervision, decriminalization, that led to this massive confusion of corruption, which rules everything. So the very first thing of the precepts of the Clean New Deal is we've got to create a new Glass-Steagall Act that separates commercial banking and investment banking. It aligns interests, but more importantly, and this is the most important caveat of all time, that millions of people have got to wrap their heads around. In the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, we used Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which are the statutes and the laws based on exigent lending capacity of the Federal Reserve that is premised to be able to stabilize us in great times of strife. Maybe it's war, maybe it's a natural disaster, this and that. You always have money on hand to be able to work your way out of a pickle, right? It was never designed to be able to float trillions of dollars to a racketeering enterprise. It literally says that in the statutes. It says that you cannot use exigent lending for floating commodities trades or speculation in real estate. It literally says that in the statutes. So the question I had to ask after I discovered that and much more along these lines is, okay, if it's so absolutely black and white and it obviously aligns with common sense and it aligns more importantly with our history, how come that never got stopped or reported or anyone else with a microphone like President Barack Obama telling us the truth? Why didn't they, Eric?
Well, I mean, I'm assuming that that's a rhetorical question, but I mean, the main thing is that I mean, this system depended on that particular law being ignored, and so many things I think we've discovered it has been that. Now, so if Glass-Steagall is basically meant to, basic from my perspective, prevent depositors' money. Like if I'm going to, whatever my bank and depositing my money there, that it's not going to be risked, in these exotic, financial instruments. And it's also not going to be used, for some sort of illegal, nefarious, financial, crime of some sort. Right. And the thing that people that just really gets stuck in my craw that Glass-Steagall would have prevented is just this very notion that these people, because of how the compensation system works, were able to game the system to use depositors' money in order to help originate loans that they then were becoming very wealthy by. And then, as the illegality and the fraudulent nature of those loans, basically came home to roost, we're the ones who basically get nothing back, yet they're the ones who are made whole. So they're gambling with our money, getting the benefit of that gambling where we get none. And then when there's a bailout, it's not us, it's them that get bailed out. And I think that this is exactly the kind of thing that a new Glass-Steagall would be a huge part in preventing from happening. And I can't think of a single person out there anywhere in the socio-political spectrum who wouldn't be fine with that, because I don't think anybody wants to have their money tied up in that kind of horse shit.
Right. But it's also the next step of that. And you're absolutely right. And thank you for that. But just to kind of put a bow on this, what I'm telling you, people, is whether, and I asked the rhetorical question, Eric, about why wasn't it stopped? Why wasn't it reported on? That was the reason we had to go on our journey to discover all these answers, first and foremost, because it was what we can see all over media today. There's consolidation of media because they lie. In fact, the former director of white collar investigations for the Department of Justice would put it as, I caught him lying, stealing, and deceiving. Okay. That's what this whole menagerie is. It's smoke and mirrors. And most of us don't think in paradigms. We don't think in systems, but we're just telling you that bad guys are robbing you blind and they're getting paid to do it. That's the most un American situation of all time. Let's just say you like outlaws, for example, right? I like a lot of outlaws. I love Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, all of these other things. What happened when they got caught stealing banks? They got shot. Okay. So what do we do to the guys that are stealing from all of us now? We give them tens of trillions of more to basically put this incredibly transactional Rico pedo pig named Donald Trump in the presidency to basically destroy everything else. So that's precept one. Now, the flip side of that, and I'm going to get to it, and maybe you want to ask the question first.
Yeah, so I mean, number two, and I think where this is like leading to is the reversal of Citizens United, right? Which, once again, what I like about this list, Patrick, just to let me interject here, is that this entire list is a collection of well-established ideas that other people have spent a lot of time in really kind of understanding and developing and getting the word out. And I like that you're not trying to reinvent anything here. What you're doing is that you're taking a collection of some of the best ideas that are out there and basically saying, well, why don't we do all of these? And number two is a great example of that. I mean, to a lot of people, it just seems like a duh, but to too many people, it's not, right? Reverse Citizens United. So why is Reverse Citizens United number two, Patrick?
Well, we talked about earlier what happened with the freak off and the P. Diddy circus. Nothing good happens in the shadows. We're talking about shadow control. We're talking about people you can't identify having outsized influence on political decisions that create all sorts of backdoor this, that, and the other that enables this monstrosity to happen. There's no accountability. It's just full on corruption, which means full on tyranny. So, for anybody who's raised to think that, oh, well, we had founding fathers for better or for worse, that goes into this whole in order to form a more perfect 248-year history that leads to the Civil War, that leads to the war on fascism, that leads to the civil rights movement. Some of the highlights of American history, right? Trying to fight that internal battle that we both know from Bill Black that it's not necessary to hope to persevere, and nobody ever wins an outright victory, right? It's human nature. There's good, there's bad, and what we have to do is minimize the bad at exploiting all of us. And millions already agree with this because we saw on the Bernie Sanders AOC oligarchy or anti-oligarchy tour, the one of the big precepts that they talk about is ending Citizens United. Yeah. How did Citizens United come to be? Because the Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell had the Powell memo that came out of tobacco, which is always, if you remember that movie, Thank You for Smoking, it's always to try to get you to do stuff that's going to be at your behest or maybe even death at somebody else's ability to exploit you, right? That's what these guys do. They lie, deny, they switch the blame and implicate, they rape, they pillage, they do this, that, and the other. And that's why we have the law to hold that to account. But when they created a Supreme Court decision where money is free speech, it led to everything that we're in the midst of. So we have to have it's a constitutional crisis. We have to have a constitutional amendment to smash Citizens United.
Right, right. I mean, but I think that this is also like a perfect example of where the imperfections of the Constitution are coming to bear. Because if we are more or less talking about in terms of democracy, one person, one vote, right? I mean, that's something that really isn't in the Constitution. I mean, it's like you all vote for, I mean, in certain places and things, especially like in local and state elections and that type of thing. But when we're talking about like our top line, national, political, politicians and such, this is not the case. Right. And, everything's going through delegates or going through whatever. It's like, it's never just like, here's one person here, here's one person there, whoever gets the most votes wins. No, I mean, it's almost never that, it seems, especially when it counts the most. Right. And so what Citizens United to me is like the total tipping over to that vaguely elitist side of the origins of our Constitution, where it's basically saying that not only are we going to make it so that your vote doesn't count because it has to go to an elector first, right? And then that elector will ultimately decide because that elector doesn't, is that supposed to be that buffer between the mob, right? I mean, all the different things in the Federalist Papers and what have you, are talking about mob rule and stuff like that, and why they created buffers between, who ends up being elected and the people who are doing the electing, right? And so that's why we have this indirect democracy, this republic. And I think that this Citizens United is like the final tipping all the way over, to, away from democracy, because not only are we going to basically truncate, who has access to the actual levers of power, but we are now going to emphasize the fact that it's all about money. And as the wealth gap becomes more and more so, that means that those people at the very, very, very top are the only ones that this country is actually doing anything for. And I think that is why I think number two is like just, it's Citizens United absolutely 100% needs to be overturned, and I think that is a brilliant addition to this particular list. Now, alongside that whole concept of like how all this money got up there to begin with is where we get into number three, because number three is where we talk about where did all these trillions of dollars, go, right? I mean, when you think about sovereign money and all this money that's being pushed out there in order to bail out all these banks, right? It's like if the government is issuing all this currency, you know, why aren't I getting any of it, right? It's like if there's $71 trillion that's floating around out there, I know I didn't get any of it. I'm pretty sure you didn't. I'm pretty sure 99.999% of the people out there haven't gotten a lick of it. But you know who has? All those people who have gone from like $1 billion dollars to now like, pushing the envelope of potentially being the first trillionaires. Those are the asshats that are benefiting from all this. And I think that there's nothing accidental about that. And I think that that is exactly what number three here is all about. It's about like basically saying, okay, let's actually look at this process of looting. Let's name names and let's show exactly where that money went, why it went there, and how it got there. And let's put these people to account. Not only do we want to embarrass them, it's like if people need to go to jail, they should go to jail. If people, I mean, how crazy, right? I mean, if I go out onto the street and I steal somebody's wallet, I'm going to jail if I get caught. And that's for like what, $15 maybe? Here's people who are stealing billions, if not trillions of dollars, and they're basically getting rewarded for it. That's
Yeah.
what number
Okay.
three, I think, addresses for me.
That's exactly right. So first of all, Elon Musk just recently has been going through, like, I haven't seen him since he dropped out of Doge. And the last time he said, which we're calling for to get a subpoena on him in a state legislature by the quid pro quo that he was talking about with, Trump being on the Epstein list, right? I haven't seen hide or tail of him, really, quite frankly, since that time period, right? But what I have heard a lot about is that he's about to get potentially $1 trillion pay package. Okay. In addition to the fact that I think sales for Tesla right now are in the dumps. And this is just part and parcel to this control fraud that you and I have become very enthralled with, and we understand all of the mechanics. And obviously, we don't need to go into that now. But to your point about just the ridiculous absurdity of this whole thing, especially of those of you out there who do believe in free markets, okay? What's free about giving people tens of trillions of dollars for failing? See, what Eric and I had discovered back when we first started this crusade or odyssey, crusade for me, odyssey for both of us, and maybe crusade for you too, Eric. But the bottom line is that we heard this term over and over called moral hazard, right? That's a very polite way of saying we're going to use the full faith and credit of the United States to give to people that are failures. Just like we've seen in corporate America the last, I don't know, 3 decades, a lot of people fail up. That goes for government too, right? We have regulators or the guys at the very top that are people that are part of the crime. And not a lot of people know that, but that's why they're there. And by the way, that's called Gresham's dynamic, and that's the entirety of the Trump presidency. But yes, this is tangible. Okay. Nobody knows this except for the people that got away with it. Let me quantify what I mean by the $71 trillion that was provided to this financial apparatus. Okay. First and foremost, in 2009, when the great financial crisis was in its worst days, they had to make a decision. And there was a lot of like scuttlebutt about, okay, we had gone through this before. I remember mainstream media interviewing at the time the gentleman who replaced Alan Greenspan as our Federal Reserve Chairman, a guy by the name of Ben Bernanke, who would wind up getting a Nobel Prize for economics for doing what I'm revealing to you. Okay. And this is part of the Obama presidency and the cover up of everything that nobody can see because they can't see the forest for the trees. So what happened was in fact, Pelosi, who just announced retirement today, and a lot of people are all over social media saying, "Oh, wow, she did so many wonderful things for us." And of course, there's a lot of other folks who aren't very happy with Pelosi over the years, considering she became worth hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of being a senator from California, right? There's a lot of reasons that happened. What I'm talking about in terms of the 71 trillion that we have to wrap our heads around is that in 2009, well, 2008 originally, there was this smoke and mirrors scenario where the government, through all of these emergency meetings, and all of the players at the time were Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, and I can't think of the other guy from Pennsylvania at the time, but it was just this bipartisan scenario where everybody had to come together to try to pretend like they were going to save the American economy and the global economy. And what we heard all the time at that time period was it was a liquidity crisis that came from the housing market. And that's where it got really confusing. And of course, we were able to sort out through our collective work. But what happened was they approved $700 billion dollars in what was known as the Troubled Assets Relief Program. The idea was to purchase the bad assets that the banks created through liar's loans that we show you in the con that you can still see, and we can sort that out. But that's the entire story of what led to the 2008 great financial crisis, liar's loans. And like Bill Black always says, it had less, it was all about audacity. He says it more cleverly than I do, but it was all crime, fraud, lies, every step of the way through the entire system. There's a assembly line that starts with lending that goes through appraisals and all sorts of things through the credit rating agencies, all through then later the securitization process and derivatives and so on and so forth. As a result of that, because everybody was panicking at the time because Wall Street had collapsed, the global economy was collapsing because there was no liquidity in the system. So publicly, the idea was we're going to pump $700 billion dollars into the financial system so that they could get lending again because businesses have to take out loans to be able to manage everything that they do and so on and so forth. And they were all bankrupt. Who's they? All the too big to fail financial
Mm.
institutions. And why were they bankrupt? Because of racketeering, which is a crime. That means that you're supposed to go down and have your entire country completely dismantled. That's really the actual,
Right.
the
Watch
requisite
the
of
con to get the details on that, everybody. I
right.
mean,
And
it's like when Go ahead.
so there was a smoke and mirrors moment that happened, and I'll never forget. We went to one of the best economists in the world that walked us through this. The guy, what's his name? Was it Baker in Washington D.C.? His name eludes me at the moment, but I mean, we went to the ends of the earth and back to get this information. So this isn't hyperbole. And then ultimately, we got it from some of the best economists in the world. But what took place in 2009, when everybody thought that we had settled the issue with $700 billion in this emergency liquidity, we provided 33 trillion through all of these smoke and mirrors from the Federal Reserve legally to the system that just destroyed the world. And I'll say that again, illegally. I don't care if you're from Harvard Law. I don't care if you're an economist. Please challenge me. I've got the receipts, okay? And it's all in the Clean New Deal here. And what we did was we provided $33 trillion to stabilize the global economy because of the interconnectivity of all of the too big to fail banks and everything else. And that ultimately, to Eric's point, went to approximately, I've always tried to suss out the numbers, but we're looking at maybe 300,000 people in the financial system, of which, of course, we know the top 0.1% got a lion's share of that stuff, which led to this ridiculous scenario of what we're in the midst of. This on the heels of Donald Trump last week or 2 weeks ago was on the floor of the UN. What am I talking about? The floor. He was addressing the UN, and he basically declared war on renewable energy. He's taking us back to fossil fuels. Okay, that's part of this. But the reason I say that is because when you understand, my friends, whether your issue is Medicare for all, for example, if your issue is education, if your issue is the paradigm change for renewable energies, all of those things, those of us who are educated, those of us who understand how the world works, those of us who understand how the law is supposed to work and the economy is supposed to work, we understand that you can't ask the question anymore, where are you going to find the money for that? What we're telling you is that we already gave 71 trillion. There's 1,000 billion and a trillion. Donald Trump's already made out with 5 billion, maybe 10 billion. I don't know what the net is since he's taken office in January. Corruption up the wazoo. This was 71 trillion. And by the way, let me finish off the receipts on that. We started with 33 trillion in 2009. Then we had a bridge of what was called quantitative easing in roughly 2012 to 2016-ish. That was about another, I think it was 16 trillion. And then on top of that, there was a repo run in 2019 that no one fully understands what happened. There was something that emanated from Japan with overnight repo loans. It was SoftBank in Japan. Just another part of the whole global economy. That's all part of the whole circumference. And we provided another $19 trillion then. That's a total of 71 trillion. By the time we got to 2019. Now, interestingly enough, they kept using Federal Reserve Act 13.3 illegally, not just from the Obama administration, but through the Trump administration during the first part of COVID, particularly to bail out casinos. How about that? And cruise lines and airlines and that sort of thing. But also, Biden used Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to stabilize, of all banks, after the crypto run and this mismanagement of interest rates back in 2022, 2023. Of all things, Silicon Valley Bank, which is directly tied, of course, to Peter Thiel and all things Palantir. So when we're talking about providing socialism for the powers that be, this is how they did it.
Right. And so being able to, like I said, being able to bring the details of all that, I think is important because I think that I mean, if we're ever going to get past some of these things, then there has to be some measure of justice, right? Or else we aren't going to get past this. And also, if there's no consequences for illegal behavior, how does that deter anybody from doing this type of thing? And so I'm going to skip number 4 for a second because I think that we're going to more easily just segue into 5, 6, and 7. I'm going to bring them all together all as one, and that's just like the concept of qualified immunity, presidential immunity, and then we've already talked about the electoral college. So I think, but let's talk about qualified immunity and presidential immunity, because I think that given what we just talked about there, that really the table for why we need to basically end that. Other than just the simple and most obvious thing of that, I thought that this and the entire notion of this country was that we have equal protection and equal opportunity under the law. And obviously, if certain people have immunity, then it's not equal, just inherently speaking. I mean, from the most basic and fundamental aspects of the founding principles of our country, as flawed as some of them may be, that one is a good one. And that's one that is obviously, perverted, just by having certain people that are immune. So I'll go ahead and I'll let you take. Let's talk about immunity and how this plays into this whole list.
Remember when we lived in LA and we also saw TV shows our whole life that even go back before we were born, where like LA cops would roll around with to protect and serve, right? We'd look up to the police officers as those who would protect us from, bad people, bad scenarios, and all sorts of things, right? And that's the ideal. The nature of these perversions, particularly as it relates to the police. Now, I do want to say with a caveat that I'm not against the police shooting to kill. I would have been all for the police shooting to kill terrorists if they had the location and get into a shootout with cells before 9/11, for example. I would have been all for, those that were protecting the Capitol on January 6th, take out MAGA for obviously an insurrection. But at the same time, I don't suggest that the cops should be above the law, particularly because we know from our kind of movie making sort of vernacular, like in the wonderful Denzel movie of which was one of the most terrifying movies I've ever seen, which was Training Day, where he played a corrupt cop in Los Angeles. The idea is, cops could plant, drugs, they could set you up, they could do this, that, and the other, and that's fascism or paramilitary sort of situation, or ICE, for example, right? And so, if the police can shoot to kill and not be held accountable, they got nothing to hide. They got nothing to resist. They're not going to protect and serve. They're going to follow orders and do what they're doing to get their bag of stash, like we just saw Tom Homan with ICE get a $15,000 bag and nobody's going to stop him. It's that absurd, right? So again, the context is that you can't have the law if it's not equal, and you can't have the law if there's no accountability. So the next phase of that is, what about judicial immunity? Look at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has literally taken over $1.5 billion in active donations to all sorts of mishigas that came from literal neo-Nazis in the case of, the guy from Dallas, for example, and his whole initiative with Clarence Thomas. But we've seen Justice Alito, we've seen the entirety of the Roberts Court and everybody else taking opportunities for gifts and this, that, and the other. This is the Supreme Court. So if they're ruling on a law where they're getting gifts from billionaires to rule favorably in their situation against everybody else, that's a complete perversion of what this entire country created.
Right.
So, and the final piece of that, of course, we just had no kings, right? And so the Supreme Court and their completely corrupt amalgamation of everything that they've done, etch a sketch, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, to tonight, the biggest idiot, Monty Python, flying circus. I like to call Donald Trump the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid. I mean, it's so pathetic, this idiot who said 2 weeks ago that there was 300 million Americans killed by Venezuelan drug lords. And then he said communism has been around for 1,000 years. The guy shouldn't be qualified to shine shoes. And that's, I hate to insult people who shine shoes. My point is, he shouldn't be the president of the United States getting over $5 billion to be above the law, to be a king. Are you kidding me? It's so perverse and so ridiculous that it's like, okay, but then the question becomes, how are you going to do it? How are we going to do it? How did Project 2025 get executive orders, this, that, and the other, to be able to pull the rug on everything, to destroy everything we thought we were? How are we going to do it, Eric?
Well, I mean, I think that to a large degree, this goes to the one that we had just skipped, right? I mean, if we're really fair about the makeup of the Supreme Court right now, right? If we're really fair and really objective about how this Supreme Court was formed, it was through lying and cheating. It was through Mitch McConnell not seating, an Obama appointee, right? I mean, it was through so many different, underhanded, things like that, and that this what we were talking about as far as like the Supreme Court is concerned. I mean, so the Supreme Court has basically given Trump carte blanche to basically be able to do everything that he's doing. I mean, and to have like and to have well, I mean, the presidential immunity comes directly from a Supreme Court, ruling, right? I mean, that's where the entire thing comes from. And the thing is that you can't have immunity like that and not expect corruption. You can't. You just simply can't, right? And so if we're going to reverse these things, I mean, I think that as problematic as I feel Gavin Newsom is to me, I think that, what happened with Proposition 50 out in California is the level of strategic racing to the bottom that we have to do, right? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that I think that a bill was put up that would have mandated independent councils to basically redistrict every state across the nation. And the Republicans, I mean, I don't hate being totally partisan on these things, but sometimes you have to call a pig a pig. The Republicans shit all over it, right? And now they're crying about Proposition 50, especially when they were basically doing the same thing in Texas. I mean, please, I mean, cry elsewhere because I'm not going to hear it, right? And so I begrudgingly am totally behind, saying that, hey, if you're in a fight and you're playing by rules and the person you're fighting isn't, you're going to lose. And so if they're if they're not going to fight by any rules, well, only way to survive this is to try to beat them at their own game and say, okay, fine, we're going to race to the bottom. It's like we try to do this where it's like everything would be fair, but it's not happening. And so I like that. I like that. And I hope that it's something that happens once and then gets completely reversed down the line where everything goes back to an independent council to where gerrymandering basically is outlawed. But we're not there yet. And I think that that is just to get to this point where we're talking about the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court was basically unethically formed, I mean, the only thing that you can do is to basically try to pull one on them. And the thing is that I don't find the idea of expanding the Supreme Court unethical. I mean, it's been done before. It's like I think that there was other periods of time in our nation's history where they think they have had up to 13 justices. But if they're gonna, but if you're gonna let Mitch McConnell pull off all the bullshit that he's gonna do, well then, hey, I have zero issue with a president coming in or somebody else coming in and saying, hey, well, guess what? We're just gonna like add a nice handful of additional Supreme Court seats, and we're gonna seat our people in there just to even that thing up. And then once you do that once, if the people in power have the restraint and the morals and the ethics to do it, then they put a cap on it and say, nope, done. This can never, ever happen again. Constitutional amendment, that's it, right? Even that might be problematic now I'm thinking about it strategically, but nevertheless, that would be the idea. But I do think that there is a tremendous amount of veracity with the idea of expanding the Supreme Court. So at that, I'm going to go ahead and let you talk about that precept or not precept that
This
the
is
Clean New Deal.
this is one of the final three precepts that we're getting close to the end of this. But to your point, again, you just devised why I had to come up with this whole continuity of this paradigmatic solution, right? Because the question I asked for you, what are we going to do, right? Nobody saw, for example, Project 2025, except for all of us who read it beforehand, but we didn't see it necessarily when you and I, for example, were on the road and we went to the headquarters of Americans for Prosperity and spoke to the gentleman who had a Harvard PhD in psychology and business and blah, blah, blah. We should have known it at the time, right? As he was giving us a bag of goods about what the Koch sort of initiative is of free market principles and, the way they were going to answer how all of this monstrosity of things that were taking place after the great financial crisis that ultimately led to this moment because they're the ones who developed with the Heritage Foundation, which is under the same umbrella, Project 25. Why? Because they're technocrats. And again, the guys that were there, the head of it, Russell Vogt, for example, comes from the same story you and I have been in the midst of the whole time. We discovered that Russell Vogt was developed in the petri dish working for Phil Gramm in Texas. Phil Gramm and Wendy Lee Graham were the guys responsible for the deregulation of supermarket market banking that led to the deregulation of the Commodity Futures Modernization Project that led to all of these derivatives disasters that created Enron in the 2008 great financial crisis and everything that's going to happen probably today as we're speaking, right? So 13 justices on the Supreme Court, to your point, and when I asked, what do we have to do? So we just had the so-called blue wave to bring it full circle, right? But nobody has a paradigmatic plan, particularly on the Democratic side, to deal with the reality of the situation. Why? Because as Bill Black always says, they are connected to the robber barons. They work to the same tune of the billionaire class that owns all of us. What I'm suggesting, short of a bloody revolution, is what Bernie Sanders had said many years ago, but he never delivered this because Bernie got caught up in playing by the rules of the corrupt, quite frankly, much to his chagrin, right? Because he speaks in platitudes. He doesn't speak in details like you and I are speaking right now. So, yes, we have to have a massive tidal wave of tens of millions of Americans on the same page, marching in unison around the entire country, developing a new cadre of people running for office in the midterms that have this information that will not allow the system, whether it's this new version of 60 Minutes or let's say Jen Psaki, who's still tied to Barack Obama, and all of the rest that want to pretend like, oh, yeah, there's a rational way out of this. No, when guys like these bad guys play dirty, you got to pull a Quentin Tarantino here. You got to be a dirty, rotten bastard, right? You got to literally get in the trenches and you got to beat these guys. Now, I'm not talking about you got to knock these guys out with ice and you got to have paramilitary forces. We're not at war yet, and it's not civil war yet. I think this is the last way that we can do this with a massive populist movement. But the question you have to ask yourself if you're feeling overwhelmed at this time, right? To get 13 justices on the Supreme Court, it just has to be part of a platform, which is the Clean New Deal, with everything else that you've heard that says with candidates that are running for the midterms, no more corruption. We're going to purge corruption. We're going to defeat that which is crushing us. And you have to understand, my friends, that this situation that we're in didn't just happen with Trump. Trump is just the consequence of everything that's taken place, quite frankly, our whole lifetimes. I think this last version has been roughly 50 years in the making.
Hmm. Yeah. And so I think that the last two I think actually fit quite well together also. So I think we can talk about them as like one thing, and part of it is such a no-brainer that it's that I almost, if I didn't know for a fact that, you know what, it still needs to be said, I would just say that it's almost embarrassing that we have to say this. But yeah, I mean, it's like prohibit insider trading from members of basically the government. I mean, come on, come on. It's like, really? That this is even a question? I mean, it's just ridiculous. And I know that that impugns people all across the aisle. It's like, as much as I like might rail upon like Trump and a lot of these Republicans, and stuff like that. I understand why people paint me as being like as partisan towards the Democrats. Well, that's not the case. It's like, you know what? Nancy Pelosi is as guilty of this type of shit as anybody on the planet and needs to be dealt with, right? I mean, there are so many people, and this is just like so clear and so obvious. I don't even know if there's anything that needs to be said other than the simple words that ban insider trading. It's like so yeah, Senate, House Representatives, Supreme Court administration, duh, absolute duh. But I think that the next that is actually on your list, second to last on this list, is conjoined to that in certain ways, and that's like the institution of term limits on senators and the House of Representatives. And I think that this is something that I've heard all the arguments for and against this, and there are some compelling arguments against this, to be sure. And then I can think of like at least a small handful of really great statespeople, who were amazing at what they were doing, like throughout their really long congressional or senatorial careers. But those people are so few and far between. And I think that the benefits that you get from people being in office for that long are not outweighed by the detriments. And so I think that's ultimately where I certainly fall. And I think a great majority of people, if they give any amount of thought to it, would probably agree that the detriments far outweigh the strengths of the idea of like having people just being in office forever, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and let you take it from here. Yeah. So obviously, like I said, insider trading is obvious, but term limits. But why specifically? This is where I'm going to give you a little bit of a thing. Why specifically term limits on the Clean New Deal?
Well, I think it almost feels like that question's rhetorical, but I appreciate it because look, I saw Mitch McConnell on the floor of the House basically stone cold, like lockjaw, right? Because the guy's too old that he couldn't even actually answer a question. And it was just unbelievable. But it's like it reminded me of that situation. Who was the spokesperson for the National Rifle Association when he was saying, not but from my cold, dead hands, right? And
Oh
it
yeah,
just,
about you're talking about the actor, uh,
yeah,
and her and come on.
of course. Right, it'll come to both of us
Anyway,
in a
yeah,
second, but
right
the
as we
point
turn
being
off.
right, and then, obviously, Nancy Pelosi announcing that she's gonna retire today after she's made out with hundreds of millions of dollars, to your point, our point on the Clean New Deal insider trading. Just to touch base on that first, look, guys, the way it works with appropriations in Congress, that you have obviously huge financial interests from certain sectors, whether it's the medical industry, whether it's obviously the military industrial complex, and we could go down the list, technical, tech bro type, just technology in general, right? So if you've got somebody with a bill that is spearheading it and getting this, moving through the system, and they're basically working for front running trades that are going to go into their back pocket, that's not working for the American people. That answers the question that we started with when we started our journey 14 years ago, where we asked, how did we go of by and for the people to of by and for the corporation, which led to of the corporation? I mean, sorry, corruption. It's elitism. All of this stuff is the perverse inverse of what this country's supposed to be. Now, for me personally, I believe in dynamism. I believe in new blood. I believe just like we just saw with Zoran Mondani. I mean, I look at him as a kid, quite frankly, with all this information that I haven't heard out of his lips. And I know where I was when I was 33 years old. We didn't have all this information. But does that mean that I don't think he should run for office? No, I think he's a very bright guy that can learn a lot of things. But just, let's see where he can go. I think that's why the founders created these scenarios where you have to elect, once every 2 years and 4 years, and then of course a president. And we're going to see this tested by Trump because I don't even think it's a question right now. I think they're going to completely have ice in the streets and try to, basically pull a Putin on the midterms. But and also probably in 2026, right? But sorry, 2028. So what I'm saying about the term limits is that when you get this goes back centuries. When you have somebody serving themselves at the behest of the people, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Corrupts absolutely. When a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. It just reminds me of that picture of Donald Trump at the trough with that big fat face feeding himself with the dollars, right? I hate it. That's not new blood. That's not dynamism. So I think that's a very important part of this. What we're just talking about is corruption here, people. And we're talking about a national movement, right? Exodus from corruption. And because of what we just had on Monday or Tuesday, sorry, it's like literally the Red Sea is parting. But yet we're still being manipulated by those that we think are on our side. So there's millions and millions of people out there that just defer to Barack Obama as the guy that is such a lovely personality. He's very charismatic. He's a nice guy. He was in our best interest. But yet it was because of Barack Obama that tens of millions of people got destroyed when the government should have actually done its job of by and for the people to hold power to account. We've been living with the aftermath ever since. And again, to go back to really what this is all premised on, the Clean New Deal from a standpoint of, obviously FDR's New Deal. And by the way, when Obama came in, he had a mandate, a national mandate to basically do the
That he
populist sort of
ignored.
that he ignored because he put all the same people that created this problem into positions of power. And this is the outcome that we're dealing with. In fact, my theory, just really quickly, is all the bad guys like Putin and MBS and all the other guys who play with the big money. I think they were like, you know what? If the law isn't the law in the United States, we're going to get ours. And they found that their their transactional pig at the trough, Donald Trump, to do it, and they did. And it wasn't Trump that did it by himself. He had this multi-billion-dollar global apparatus that was involved, and a lot of this is speculation, but a lot of it obviously is as clear as day, right? And I think they're crashing the economy. So what I would say to everybody who's lasted this long in this, thank you first and foremost for doing this. Thank you, Eric, for guiding us through this. But I want to say as a concluding argument that we've been dealing with corruption now for far too long. Everybody knows the system is rigged. Just like George Carlin said, it's a big club and you're not in it. And it's an affront to everything that we are. And we are now an authoritarian state that is becoming more and more fascist by the day. And you have to understand the formula is corruption births and fuels fascism. When you take out corruption, you take out fascism. Why? Because then you restore the law, which is all predicated on character. And that's in integrity, I should say. And that's what this is. And remember, FDR said in 1936 on the floor of Madison Square Garden, he basically addressed all of the ancient enemies of liberty and justice because these people, their mentality has been around for thousands of years. It's the mentality of the kings. It's the same thing over and over, just disguised and wrapped in a different package, right? That is all antithetical to the United States. It's all antithetical to the American dream. And when you plug the Clean New Deal into a national movement to be able to do this, and all of the answers are in the cleannewdeal.org, even more, what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and everything else. When we get millions of people to do this, this is the response to Project 2025.
All right. So that was the Clean New Deal, Patrick Lovell, and I'd like to thank everybody for spending your time with us. And let's keep on marching. We're gonna have a just society someday, and hopefully sooner rather than later.
And hopefully peacefully. This is a civil rights like movement to restore justice and the integrity of law. Thank you guys. Onwards and upwards.